for online.
Thank you. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning today's speech. Welcome, Rambam. We're learning Hilchos Sanhedrin, the Ha'onshin Hamasudim Lahem, the laws of the courts and the penalties placed under their jurisdiction. Chapters 4, 5, and 6, Perek Revi, Chamishi, and Shishi. We are starting with the fourth chapter. Now we're going to learn about what's known to be smicha. In other words, the permission that is given to some for them to have the power of a real dayan. Perek Revi has 15 halachas, beginning with halacha aleph, says that Echad Beis Din Hagadol. Whether we're speaking about the great Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin Ketano, or even a Beis Din of 3, each judge must have received smicha, ordination. Now, I know that there are different girsas in the Rambam. That's the version that we are reading. Even the other girsas that I don't remember by heart will come to the same point. In other words, just to make it clear right now, that the word smicha that we use today is a borrowed term. It's important that we have it, but that's not what we're talking about over here. There is the real smicha ordination, and in the Sanhedrin Gedolah, Sanhedrin Ketana, and the Beis Din of 3, every judge must have smicha, and as we'll explain a bit later, that real smicha ceased because of the conditions that are needed for smicha to continue. And we'll speak more about the Rambam's opinion as to how do we restart it. And historically, there were a few attempts to restart it, and we'll speak about one as we get through this chapter. Moshe Rabbeinu himself, Samach Yehoshua Bayad, he actually physically placed his hands and leaned on the head of Yehoshua, as it says in Parshas Pinchas, Vayismach es yadav olav vayitzavehu, that Moshe placed his hands on him and he commanded him. Furthermore, when we have that whole story in the portion of Baha'aloischa, all of the 70 elders that were appointed, Moshe Rabbeinu gave them smicha, not by placing his hands on them, but giving them smicha, as we'll describe in a moment. And through that, and because of that, the shadas aleim shechina, the shechina rested upon those 70. Those elders who received smicha from Moshe have the power to give smicha to others, and others to others. And that's how smicha was passed down. Now, people hear this, they say, okay, that's exactly what smicha is today. Yes and no. This part of smicha continued. But as the Rambam paskins, as everyone paskins, this, from when we entered the Holy Land, Moshe Rabbeinu, right, led us when we left Mitzrayim in the Midbar. But from when we went into the Holy Land, the power of giving smicha is connected to being in the Holy Land. And that's why historically, the Romans who wanted to take out, who wanted to destroy the power, the Jewish institutions, the Sanhedrin, they did not allow for smicha to be given in the Holy Land. And we have in the Gemara stories of Tanoim that were Mamas Moshe Nefesh, right? I think it was Yehuda ben Bava that gave smicha to 300 people at one time, and he was terribly murdered by the Romans. But eventually, towards the end of the era of the Gemara, smicha ceased to happen. And once you have a whole generation that did not receive smicha from the generation above them in the Holy Land, now you got a problem. Now, again, we'll learn later that Rambam's opinion and how such a thing could be restarted. The Nimtzor comes out that that everyone has smicha, this has to be a direct link. A man from another man going back to the Beis Din of Yehoshua. Now, as we know, Yehoshua has a unique power because he got smicha with the hands of Moshe. And until the Beis Din of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the 70 elders. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu gave smicha twice, to Yeshua on one level and then to the 70 elders. Now, the Echad Hanismach B'Pi HaNasi doesn't make a difference whether you, the recipient, get it directly from the Nasi. And as we learned yesterday, the Nasi is the leader of the Sanhedrin, who's in the place of Moshe Rabbeinu, or whether you get smicha from someone else who got it from someone who got smicha. That makes absolutely no difference. Even if the guy who gave you smicha never served in the Sanhedrin, if he receives smicha from someone who receives smicha, as we said, all the moment of the giving and the receiving has to happen in the Holy Land, as we'll see. Then that's how smicha goes down. Halacha 2. The Ketzeri Smicha Lodoyus. Smicha forever is not the way Moshe Rabbeinu gave Smicha to Yeshua, meaning you don't need to have to, for the giver to give to the recipient through placing his hands on the head, but Smicha is by making a declaration, by the person receiving Smicha being called the Rebbe, and he's going to be taught, we're going to say to him, you hereby have Smicha. And therefore, you have the permission, ladun, even dine knasas, even in cases involving financial penalties. And as we'll speak out already, we'll get ahead of ourselves a little bit. Nowadays, we don't yet have the smicha again. But it doesn't mean that there's no place for a beis din. There is a place for a beis din, but they have limitations. One primary difference between whether the beis din is comprised of judges who have the real smicha or not is whether they have the legal right to adjudicate financial penalty cases. You need to have smicha to have that power. A bit more soon. Halacha 3. When smicha is being conferred, it has to be done in the presence of 3. We don't need for all 3 to themselves have smicha. We need one of the 3 to have smicha, but it must be given with 2 others joining. Halacha Daled, whenever you find in scripture the word Elohim, not in reference to God Almighty, and then we don't even pronounce the word, we say Elohim, but there is the same word that at times is used in reference to a court that only is going to refer to a court of Dayanim who have Smich. Ela based in Shenismuchu Beretz Yisrael Bavad. Here the Rambam introduces again this nuance. It's not only smicha, but it's smicha that was conferred in the Holy Land. Now, don't forget, guys, Moshe Rabbeinu did not give it to Yeshua in the Holy Land. Moshe Rabbeinu, as of yet, never merited to go into the Holy Land. We know that. But from when we entered Eretz Yisrael, it must be given there. V'heim ho'anashim ha'chachamim haru'im ladum shabatku oisam based in Shal Eretz Yisrael, and v'himchu oisam, the word himchu means they were appointed, and they were smicha was conferred upon them. Halacha. But initially, whoever got smicha automatically had the right to give smicha to his students. However, at the time of Hillel the elder, right in the beginning of the times of the Mishnah, during the times of the Second Temple, the Chachamim cholku kavod to base Hillel Hazaken, and you see, it's not to Hillel as a person, but really, it's an honor being given to the fact that Hillel was a descendant from Beis David. But the Rambam used it to the Beis Hillel, and they made a takana that what that the nasi, which is, as we mentioned, the head of the Sanhedrin, has to give his approval prior to smicha being conveyed to a candidate. Not that the nasi has to be the one giving it. Make it very clear. But everyone that got smicha from that time on, so a letter was sent to Hillel or to the nasi of the Sanhedrin, and they needed explicit, so to say, reshus. They needed to agree. They needed an approval for every individual who's going to get smicha. And again, the Rambam makes it clear. It's not that the only one being able to give the smicha is the nasi. No. My guys, don't forget, the nasi also had the right to give smicha. But they made another interesting takana. If the nasi gave smicha, now they're limiting the power of the nasi. The nasi can only give smicha if the av beis din is with him. Similarly, if the av beis din is the one giving the smicha, the nasi has to be with him. But if any other elder is going to be giving smicha, I know they need to have the approval of the nasi, but once that approval was given, it could be given by anyone who has smicha. Then, he doesn't have to have any second in command with him, but you have to have 2 other Jews with him. So there should be 3. Now, when we said before that the nasi has to give it with the av beis din, the av beis din has to give it with the nasi present, they also needed 3. So they had a 3rd individual. Halacha 6. Smicha cannot be given outside of the Holy Land. Even though the ones who want to give smicha themselves got it in the Holy Land. Doesn't work. Even more. If the one conferring smicha is in the Holy Land, the one receiving the smicha is outside. Also, it does not work. If the ones giving smicha are b'chutz la'aretz, even though the ones receiving it theoretically would be in the Holy Land, it also will not work. In other words, they both have to be in Israel. They don't have to be together. They don't have to be together. They can be in one place, the other guy can be in the other place, a letter can be sent. Then, so how would he get it? By sending a letter. They notify him that you receive smicha, meaning he's going to be given permission to adjudicate even dinei knossos, even financial cases. How did it work? Because they were both in the Israel. The whole Eretz Yisrael. Now, what the boundaries of Israel? The Rambam writes, any part of the Holy Land that was conquered by the Jews who entered from Egypt, meaning under the leadership of Yeshua, that's a place that is fit for smicha to be given and to be received, which is a chiddush, because we already learned so many times the shit of the Rambam that when the first temple was destroyed, the initial kedusha of the Holy Land departed. Yes, it was brought back when Ezra, led the building of the second temple, but Ezra did not settle all of the land. So for many other halachas, not all of the Holy Land that was holy in the times of Yeshua was re-sanctified again, but for smicha, that Rambam was saying, suffices that it was conquered by Olam Mitzrayim. Halacha 7. One who's conferring smicha, we already said he has to have the approval of the Nasi, but he got the approval. He can give at one time to many people. David HaMelech one time gave smicha to 30,000 people in one day. Wow. Halacha 8. There's another rule. Smicha doesn't have to be given in a way that the recipient now has all of the powers of a judge. You can give a specified smicha, giving permission to the recipient to adjudicate specific rules or also for a specific amount of time only. But when can you give someone a specialized smicha? Only if they are knowledgeable, if they are able to give halachic rulings in all of the Torah. I would give a mashal, if I can give a mashal, a doctor. So doctors specialize in certain fields. But prior to them becoming specialists, they have to become an MD. They have to have a general knowledge. This is the same thing over here. You can give smicha to something specific, but that's only for who that individual is roi l'chol advarim. He must be able to adjudicate all matters. Why will they not give him permission to adjudicate all matters? Doesn't matter right now. There's many historic reasons for that. For example, chacham mufla. If you have a great wise person, extraordinary chacham, that is indeed ra'oi, he's fit to give halachic rulings in all of the Torah. Yesh lebezin lismecha isai. Bezin, if they want to, they can give him smicha. They can tell him, you have the right to adjudicate only financial matters, but not to get involved in Isser V'Heter, or only Isser V'Heter in the area of kashrus, what's good, what's not good, what's permitted, what's prohibited, but not to adjudicate financial matters. Or they can tell him, you can give, you have the right to be a judge in finances, you have a right to be a judge in Isser V'Heter, but you don't have the right to give any rulings regarding financial penalties. Or the opposite, you can only give rulings regarding financial penalties, but you don't have permission to decide whether a bukhar is blemished and therefore it may be eaten, or it's not a blemish and therefore it's still holy. Or you can give, there's such a concept of getting smicha only to be matan adarim, only to release vows, or only to see ksamim, which is something very common today, that some people, they get trained to see ksamim, whether that color, that shade of the stain is halachically blood or not. But the Rambam is very clear that even though you can give a limited area of smicha, the individual has to be fit to get all of smicha. Halacha 9. You can also give smicha only for a certain amount of time. And to tell to the nismach, which is finances, only until when the nasi comes here, or only as long as you are with us in the city. So he has the intellectual capacity, qualification, but he's blind in one of his eyes. Even though he's fit to adjudicate financial matters, not with smicha, without smicha. Okay? Now, I want to make it very clear because this is relevant today. No one has smicha yet today. One of the big differences, whether a judge has smicha or not, is that what were to happen if a judge errs in his halachic ruling. And this is something that we will learn, God willing, today, in today's third chapter, in the sixth chapter. Something that happens. We will see that there will be times where the judge is on the hook. There'll be certain scenarios where if he received real smicha, he won't be financially responsible because he was considered someone qualified. So he had the right to sit in judgment. Certain mistakes we can tolerate post facto. If he does not have smicha, in those same scenarios, as we'll learn today in the sixth chapter, he'll be chayv to compensate from his own pocket. So
Rabbi, do they have appellate courts? Like, so somebody makes a mistake and they can go above to ask a greater court that maybe he made a mistake?
They did it in the following way, Baruch, is that whoever gave a ruling needed to write his ruling and its sources. And it didn't even have to be refuted by other greater judges. See, the beauty, we collectively, if we were to study rulings of courts, which we have today, books, it's beautiful. If we as a group, we can refute it. And the beauty is that there is like the people are the jury. The Jewish people are filled with scholars. If the consensus is that our group refuted the sources of the judge, then we're going to knock him down. It doesn't only have to come from judges. And hopefully judges are humble. Hopefully, when you have a certain opinion, in your world as a doctor, I'm sure that if you have a consensus of doctors that disagree, a normal person says, I think I'm right, but I have to, I'm going to give in to the majority. There's a majority concept. Okay. Then a guy, even if he's blind with one eye, doesn't get smicha. Why? Because since someone who's blind in one eye may not adjudicate certain cases, as we'll see, and we just established that you can only get smicha even if the kavana, if the purpose is to give you smicha in only one area, you can only get it if you are fit to be a judge in all areas. Halacha 11. What happens if in Israel there's only one Jew left with smicha? And we don't want for smicha to be interrupted, as it got interrupted in the times of Hillel the Minor, which is terrible. So he takes two people sitting next to him, and the first thing he should do is he should give smicha to 70 people at one shot, or one right after the other. Why? Because we want to have a Sanhedrin, and then you should appoint the 70 as the Beis Din Haggadah, even though they're not in Yerushalayim. The Sanhedrin Gedolah doesn't have to function. It's better if they're sitting at home in the temple, but they can function in Israel. And that Sanhedrin should right away give smicha to others. Now the question is, what were to happen if no one has smicha? That happened again during the end of the era of the Talmud, because the Romans did not want for us to have this judiciary branch. They didn't want for Jewish institutions to have continuity. All they needed to do, and they succeeded, is they outlawed the giving of smicha in Israel. So even though in Babylonia, where the Talmud was put together, the Iker Talmud Babylon, there one rabbi gave permission to the other to give halachic rulings, but since it was not done in Israel, it wasn't real smicha. And it was outlawed in Israel, and they outlawed it in Israel. And again, like I mentioned, in the times of the Tanoim, there were times that there was only one Jew left with smicha. And they gathered hundreds and they gave smicha, and the Romans killed them. They tortured them to death. And at the end, they succeeded. So now what? So there's a big debate. What do we do now? Now, we believe in the resurrection. If someone who got smicha comes back to life, he has smicha. As long as he gives it in Israel, he can give further. But the Rambam is not going to subscribe to the miraculous, even though we believe in the miraculous, but we're going to try to figure out legally, how do we continue, or how do we reawaken smicha with the way the world works right now? And the Rambam is writing like this, I think that of all of the rabbis or the chachamim that live in Eretz Yisrael, all of them agree to give one person smicha, because they're basically saying that person is qualified to be the head of a Sanhedrin. If they all agree, then that person can be given smicha. V'yesh lahem, and that person has real smicha. Now that person has the right to adjudicate even financial penalty cases, and that person now has the right to give smicha to others. And that person will have to do what we just learned of getting 2 other rabbis with him without smicha, and right away appointing 70 to have a Sanhedrin. Now hold on. If that's a solution, so the Rambam is asking, so why were we so we were so anguished by the fact that smicha was interrupted? This is a simple solution. Why were they in pain that the smicha should never be interrupted? For there never to be an interruption, and judges who can even rule in financial penalty matters. The Rambam says because Jewish people are spread out. Spreading out means not only geographically, but we have different approaches. How do you get all of the Jewish rabbinate to agree that that person is fit? Go do that. Let's see Mashiach doing that. Like that's the biggest of, that's bigger than the miracle of the splitting of the sea. However, if smicha would not be interrupted, as we mentioned, that means if whoever has smicha got it from someone who got smicha all in the Holy Land, going back to Moshe Rabbeinu, that individual doesn't have the consent of all. That's why it's easy to give smicha if you have it. The Rambam says this is what I think, but the Rambam writes words that are very rare. And this really has to be weighed. The Rambam is saying on himself, I'm not 100% certain. Now let me tell you like this. Just one of the, you can Google all this. I'm not even talking about in recent times, but during the times of Rabbi Yosef Karo, right, there was a rabbi called Rabbi Yaakov Beirav. Going back 500 years. Rabbi Yaakov Beirav did this, got all of the rabbis minus one, and conferred smicha to the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Came along Rabbi Levi ben Chaviv, one rabbi, and he opposed it. And this became a big machlokes.
What was his problem?
Well, the problem is whether we rely on the Rambam or not.
So the
whether we have to wait, whether we have to wait, because there's a lot of power in restarting the smicha. This is not the only time that it happened, but this is the most famous time. And again, we're learning 3 chapters in a relative small amount of time, but just remember this name. The big machlokes between Rabbi Yaakov Beirav and Rabbi Levi ben Chaviv. Ultimately, all sides, not to perpetuate the machlokes, stopped continuing the smicha at that time in history. Halacha Yud Beis. Based on Shenismachu Beretz Yisrael, if they already got smicha in Israel, they already got it. Then they moved permanently, temporary to outside of Israel. They have the right to continue to function as a real judge. Even b'chutz la'aretz, just the way they can rule it in the Holy Land. In other words, the Sanhedrin can function also outside of Israel, but smicha can only be given in Israel by someone who got smicha in Israel. By someone who got smicha. In other words, our connection to Israel is so powerful geographically that it touches the heart of the branch of the judiciary, which is very powerful. Halacha Yud Gimel. Rashi Gal Yeshuv Babel. Now there are other people that have the right to confer a different type of smicha. So the heads, we mentioned that for hundreds of years, when we lived in Babylonia, we're going back, we moved to Babylonia in bulk at the end of the first temple, but we were there already before. And we were there throughout the whole Second Temple era. We were there after the Second Temple era for hundreds of years. That was the headquarters of the scholarship of the Jewish people. The Babylonian government gave the Jews the legal right to rule ourselves in almost all areas. And the head of the Jewish government is called the head of the Golus, the head of the diaspora, and he had governmental power. So the head of the Golus and Babel, halachically, is in the place of a Jewish king, which means that he therefore has the right, he has the right to rule over the Jewish people, which includes he has the right to call someone to court, whether that individual consents or not, very much like the government today. If I'm subpoenaed by a court, whether it's through the legal system or if the government calls me in, I don't have the right to say, who are you? No, I'm an American citizen. I'm subservient to the local governance. So this, 1 second, and the Shenemar, as it says, and this is a Jewish concept. When it says Lo Yasud, Yaakov Avinu blessed the son Yehuda, Lo Yasud Shevet Mi Yehuda. The staff is a symbol of law and order, of Gevura, will never depart from Yehuda. People say, how can Jacob give a blessing that did not come to fruition? But after the temple was destroyed, the answer is no. Even after the temple was destroyed, by divine providence, the leaders of the Golus, and even afterwards, the leaders of the Jewish people are from the tribe of Yehuda. And they have certain legal rights to rule over the people. Now, therefore, let's continue with that. What happens if you have a judge who's worthy, but he did not get smicha, but he was given a permit, he was given permission from the head of the Golus to be a judge. He also has halachic legal power, primarily to force people to come to court, to call people to court. Even if the litigants don't want to go. See, today, which court has such a power? They don't have such a power. Beis Din doesn't have that power. The most they can do, God forbid, is to put someone in a chayden. But if a Beis Din calls you to court, halachically I have to go. But if I don't go, then what? They have the power. The head of the Golus did not their certificate that you are appointed as a judge, did not give the judge the permission to judge financial penalty halachic matters. That's something that you have to have real smicha for. But other than in that area, that's another way that someone becomes appointed as a judge. Now, the roya remains. It's if you're not fit, that means if you were appointed, whether by smicha, whether appointed by the head of the Golus, but you're not worthy, your certificate halachically is worth nothing. But if you are fit to judge, and indeed you got either permission from the Beis Din in Eretz Yisrael, Rishus Ladun, Rishus Ladun. So the power of smicha, if you get it through smicha, Yesh Ladun b'chol Eretz Yisrael, you have the right to adjudicate cases geographically in the Holy Land and in all of the cities that are by the boundaries at the borders of Israel. Meaning, permission means that you have the right to call people to court, even though they don't want to come. They must obey. They must come. Aval b'chutz la'aretz, someone who has smicha outside of Israel, they cannot force people to come to their court, even though they have the power of ruling, adjudicating even financial penalty cases outside of Israel, but only to people that are willing to accept. But to force people to come to court, he has no such permission. That is something that exclusively is given to the hands of the Rosh of the Golus. Only the Rosh of the Golus is someone who he himself, and in extension, if he gives that power to others, he can empower people to behave as a governmental body. Meaning, you have to listen, you have to obey. And the final halacha tezvav is extremely important. Whoever is not ro'ui ladun, whoever is not fit to be a judge, and there's two qualifications. One is knowledge, either because he lacks knowledge or because he doesn't have the fine character traits that is essential for a judge. It's not great that the judge is anav. These characteristic traits that we learned yesterday have to be there. Now, how did he get smicha? I don't know. Whether someone was bribed to give him smicha, whether it was on other side, this we don't care. If Sha'ava Rosh Golus, if the head of the Golus gave him permission, or if the Beis Din, the Sanhedrin made a mistake and they gave him smicha, this guy's certificate is worth nothing. And the Rambam's example is what happens if you have an animal that has a halachic blemish and someone's consecrated it to go on the altar. Even though you make that verbal count, this animal is for korban oila, does nothing because the animal is not fit. If the person is not fit, the certificate is worthless. Ein kiddusha chala olav. Well, now one.
But was there a case where the Jews had to sacrifice an animal that was not kosher, and because of that, a lot of stuff happened to them? Why did
so
they
you're
not do
referring to the Gemara in Gittin, one event that happened by Kamsa bar Kamsa. There was a blemish. The animal was consecrated by the Goyish general before the animal was blemished. That animal was actually consecrated, but subsequently it was given a blemish that was halachically problematic. Correct.
So, according to this, why not do it if it means nothing?
No. Okay, that's a whole different topic. Here we're speaking about if the animal had a blemish before you consecrated it, cave, and it won't even become holy to begin with. There was a suggestion to offer it to save lives, but that animal was already home. Okay, coming back over here. Today's second chapter, the fifth chapter of the laws of Sanhedrin and the Ha'anshin HaMasurim Lahem is going to be what exactly must be judged in a Sanhedrin. Note, for what do you need to have the court of 71? For what do you need to have a court of 23? And what else could be judged even in a court of 3, etc.? This chapter has 18 halachas, beginning with halach. Guys, this is fascinating. Halach. Ein mamin melech. Let me tell you for what you need to have the great Sanhedrin. Now understand something, guys. We're coming towards the end of the Rambam. The Rebbe says we are at the end of the Golus. Really, Mashiach is within our hands. There's something that we need to do, the Rebbe says, to make it, to bring it down over here. And one of the things that we will go back to is to have a king. Now, I know that some people are of the opinion that when the Rambam speaks about the king, he means a Jewish government. So be it. The head of the Jewish government. I'm not speak with the halachic power of the Jewish leader has to be given through the Sanhedrin. It's a whole different system. The Rambam is not negating the possibility that there'll be some sort of voting. That's a whole different topic. But ultimately, what makes him the king? Like who crowns the king? The Sanhedrin. And we already learned yesterday how we get a Sanhedrin. So that's the first thing for what you need to have a great Sanhedrin. Another thing, you only appoint minor Sanhedrins for every tribe and for every city only through the Sanhedrin of 71. That's their area. They are the ones that give the final seal of approval for every single other Sanhedrin that's going to be established. The aim done, and now there are certain big halachic cases that can only be adjudicated by the great Sanhedrin. Number one, if you have an entire tribe that, God forbid, they were led to idol worship with a lot of penalties. This is not penalties to a individual, that's to a whole tribe that can only be judged by the great Sanhedrin. If someone is being judged as being a false prophet, if a Kohen Gadol is being tried for a capital case, that can only be done by the great Sanhedrin. And Rambam writes, all money cases can be judged even by a court of 3. Now, where does the minor Sanhedrin come in? We'll get to. That's the Rambam Zor.
Kohen Gadol erred and was ever the stories of like
not that comes to mind, but some Kohanim Gedolim were not kosher people during the times of the Second Temple. And even though they were not kosher people, in honor of the office, that can only happen at least. They can only be judged by the great court. What that we'll learn about soon. There's something called a rebellious elder. We cannot punish a whole city that was led astray to idol worship. We cannot make a soy to drink the bitter waters, only in the great Sanhedrin. Similarly, if we want to expand the boundaries of Yerushalayim and HaKodesh, halachically, and we already learned the procedure, it can only be done with the great Sanhedrin. If they want to expand the area of the courtyard of the temple, only with the great Sanhedrin. We cannot go out to voluntary wars without the approval of the great Sanhedrin. If you have a person that was found, a corpse, outside a city, when we don't know who's the murderer, so that whole parsha of measuring from the corpse to the closest city, it has to be done under and through the Beis Din HaGadol. And this is what we have in Parshas Yisro. When the Yisro made a suggestion, a lot of it was accepted by God, that Kol Hadavar HaGadol, that all of the great matter should be brought to you, Moshe Rabbeinu. That means that forever the above halachic issues can only be ruled in a great Sanhedrin. Halacha 2 ain't done in the nefashos. Now, all other capital cases, not financial cases, any type of case, it can only be judged in the minor Sanhedrin, which is in a court of 23. Doesn't make a difference whether it's a case where a human being is put on trial or even a case where an animal is being put on trial. And if the animal will be found guilty, the animal will be put to death. It can only happen through a Sanhedrin Ketana. If there's an ox that has to be stoned to death because it killed a person, or an animal that it was active or passive in an act of bestiality, which we're going to know that to be a fact, the animal will also be put to death. Furthermore, even a lion, an ari, or a bear, or a nomad, or bardalis, a leopard, a cheetah, that what? Even we learned, even if they were domesticated, and halachically, these animals are essentially undomesticatable, and they have owners, and they killed someone. And the rule is that an animal that killed a human being has to be put to death. Even though here you would think, yeah, come on, the lion killed someone. We don't need that much proof. Makes a lot of sense. No, you can only put to death with one exception, where the Rambam wants to make it clear that if a snake killed someone, don't bring the snake to court. You killed the snake.
Snake always comes up as being just like
the
humans.
snake always comes up. L'chaim. The snake is also the Yetzer Hara. All right. Take the law in your own hand with the snake. Someone spreads a malicious report, specifically that he married a woman, and he's claiming right after he married her that she was not a virgin. And furthermore, he's claiming that she lost her virginity after she was halachically consecrated to him, which means she committed adultery, which means that if he's going to be found to be saying the truth, she's going to be put to death. So since if she's going to be found guilty, she'll be put to death, you can only open up this case in a basin of 23, because anything that might come to someone being judged by 23, because see, they did in the fashas. Now, if we already see that he's not saying the truth, now what happens in such a case is that it's going to be flipped. He's going to be very much penalized, but he won't be put to death. The moment we know that what he's saying is not true, you can pass it on to a court of only 3, because now it's becoming a money matter. And even though the money matter, some of it is a knas, right? Remember, he has to pay 100 shekel. In the case where she's a nara, he has to pay it to her father. Doesn't matter. Dinei knases, like we learned, could be adjudicated by anyone who has real smicha, and it doesn't have to be in a minor sanet. Where do we get this number of 23? Number one, it's really divrei Kabbalah, not mysticism. Kabbalah means that's the way God told Moshe Rabbeinu. But there is an allusion to it in Scripture. There has to be 23. What's the logic? Because since it says in the portion of Masay, the shaftu ha'edam etzilu ha'edam, this is regarding a trial which is involving a capital case. He'll be judged by an Eidah. Now, the word Eidah is one of the words that we have for a congregation. And we already learned from the Meraglim that the Meraglim are called Adas, and even though they were sinners. But an Eidah there were 10 Meraglims that sinned. So the word Eidah can only be conferred on a group of at least 10 Jewish adult males. The Shaftu ha'Eidah, the Hitzilu ha'Eidah, the word Eidah is written twice. Eidah sheifetes v'hamachayvin, the Elam atzeles v'hamazakin. Those are speaking about judges. Some of them are going to say the guy is guilty. Eidah. We want to have a case where you can have a whole Eidah citing that the guy is chayiv, a whole Eidah that he's potter. The Eidah bachs masada, so you have already 20. So that should be a court of 20. No, the Rambam says you can never have a court of 20 because you always have to have an odd number court. So say it's 21. Can't have a judge. You can't have a court of 21 because, as we'll learn soon, as we learned in the introduction, that when it comes to capital cases, even though the general rule is you have to follow the majority, even a majority of only 1, in a capital case, someone can only be found guilty. For that, there has to be a majority of 2. So Eidah means we want to have 10 people chayiv, 10 people zakah. Now we have to create a scenario where it's not the same, but you have 2 against 1, a majority of 2. So that's the 23. That's the illusion. Again, it's really God told that to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moisif and Shloisha Kadeshi based in Shaku, the year boy Acharabam Lahatois. Okay, halacha 4. Makas can be given even by a court of 3, even though someone might die when you flog him. Don't allow Kavan to be the flogger, but might hurt, but doesn't matter. But the guy is judged only to get flogged. 5. Whenever you have that case that we just mentioned, where someone was found, the corpse was found, and ultimately you're going to decapitate the egla, it's under the jurisdiction of the great Beis Din, but that act of arifa has to be done by a Beis Din of 5. So really, when people say, the courts are either of 71, 23, or 3, which is what we learned yesterday, there's more nuance. Some courts have to have at least 5. Ibur HaChodesh, the court to decide whether you're going to add a date to the month, you have to have 3. But to decide whether you're going to add a month to the year, to make it into a leap year, right? For that, you have to have 7. All of that we have in Masechta Sanhedrin and sources and why. And all of these judges have to have smicha, as we learned about. No, it's all of the judges in a court have to have smicha. And indeed, since there's no smicha today, no one gets malchus. You don't have smicha. You can't do that. Halacha 8. Here we go. Dinei kenosis. Anything that's in the category of financial penalties. For example, Gezela. Now, Gezela, just to make it clear, if God forbid, if Reuven robbed Shimon, giving back the item or the value of what was robbed is not called a penalty. That's called compensating for the money. If he stole 100, he has to give back 100 or the item. But if the robber first took an oath, I didn't rob, So not only did he rob, but he swore in vain, and then he does tshuva. The Torah writes he has to then give back the item plus a halachic fifth. That adding of the fifth is called a penalty or chabala. And without getting into the detail, but we already established that when a person injures his fellow, there are 5 categories of damages that he has to pay. 5 categories. Nezek, tsar, ripu, shavas, boishes. And as the Rambam already explained, many of them are under the category of penalty, of penalty and not of money. V'tashlume kefil, the double of a ganaf. If a guy is a ganaf, not a robber, but a ganaf. It means if I hide when I go into your house, I don't want anyone to catch me. I'm afraid of people. I'm just not afraid of God. If I'm caught, I have to give you what I took plus double. The double is a penalty. Or if I stole an animal and I shechted it or I sold it, I have to sometimes pay 4 times the amount, 5 times the amount. I'm a fata. If a person, God forbid, rapes a girl, if a person seduces a minor girl, in all of these cases, you have a certain financial penalty that's not in the category of money, it's in the category of penalty. Money means when we can measure how much I took, and that's the money that I have to give back. Anytime the Torah gives a set number for all, whoever rapes amongst the penalties is a certain fixed amount of money. That's in the category of penalty. That can only be adjudicated by a beis din of 3, but they have to be mumchen. Now, I know the word mumcha literally means experts. In this context, it doesn't mean an expert. It means with smicha. Real smicha, that no one has today. But all of the other financial matters, at least that now you know why a beis din can function today. What are all other financial matters? If there are someone who admitted that they owe money, or for loans, for that you don't have to have mumcha, because you don't have to have people with smicha. Even 3 hedyotis, we mentioned so many times that Yaron, hedyot, an idiot, comes from the same root. Stam 3 people. And more, even if there's only one, but that one is an expert, even though he doesn't have the power of a beis din, but we learned he's allowed, even rabbinically we learned yesterday, he is allowed to adjudicate the case. That's why nowadays you have people that gather together and they function as a so-called beis din, and they give halachic rulings regarding people who admitted they owe money, regarding loans, even chutz la'aretz. Elohim, they're never conferred with the name Elohim. Nevertheless, what power do they have? Why do they have any power? Because they have the power of shluchim, of the beis din of the Holy Land. Amazing. But even though they act as shluchim, they don't have all of the powers of those who have smicha. But they don't have permission to adjudicate financial penalty matters, even though they're, so to say, shluchim. Not so to say, even though they have a din of shlichus regarding all other financial matters.
Are they called Elohim because they're sitting in the place of God?
They're not called Elohim because the Rambam said before, without smicha, you're not called Elohim. And let me say better. What we're really learning, the way that Rambam words it, is that the word Elohim is always about a godly power. How is it that sometimes the Torah uses the words Elohim, and we don't even have to change the way we pronounce it regarding a beis din, because since they have smicha, the Shekhinah is residing with them. So we are actually giving them a name that sometimes we give to God. That's because they are meriting to channel godliness. But for that, you need to have smicha. If you got smicha, you could, okay, weiter. Another rule, that this power as shluchim, which allows people nowadays, even without smicha, to function as a beis din, it's only regarding dinim hamitsuyim tamid. This is so important. It's only regarding cases that commonly occur. And not either or. Another number has to be something that's common, because you can't have a community which will constantly having disputes with each other without having an organ that will step in there and resolve it. And by the way, many times beis din's resolutions are not accepted by everyone. They're not happy with it. But since it's a common issue, you have to have such a system. And it has to be something, that's very important. It has to involve financial loss. Like if someone admitted, yeah, you loaned me money, well, then I owe you the money. Or all loans. Or if I damaged your property, if I'm not going to be told by a beis din pay up, the guy is going to lose money. But matters that are not common, even though there's financial loss. Gives an example that if an animal damaged another person, that's domesticated animals generally don't hurt other people. even though he damaged the person or damaged their property, damaged a person. Or if there's something that happens in common, but there's no financial loss, like the double payment of a ganav. If the victim will get the thing back, even though he won't get back doubled, he won't have any loss. And the Rambam is saying that ganavim are common occurrence, but there's no financial loss. Ain't done in all of the financial fines that the Chachamim imposed. If you remember, no, it's not that there is actual injury, but there's amount of shame. Like if a person hits his fellow with a punch, that's called toikeya. I don't know in the modern Hebrew. Toikeya means you punched. Soited with a test means you slapped. Remember, we learned big numbers, and if the guy's a Talmud Chacham, fortunes, you pay for that. The judges in Chutz La'aretz, meaning judges without smicha, cannot adjudicate. Another thing, all cases for which you only have to pay half damage, if you remember, that's called a tam, can never be collected by the Yonei Chutz La'aretz, with the one exception of if an animal is walking, and as it's walking and it's stepping on the ground that doesn't have the type of pavement we have today. So there's little pebbles on the ground, and a pebble goes flying, spritzes a pebble, that's called nitzoitzes, tzeroidos. And halachically, you are responsible to pay for only half of the damage. That's not called kanas, that's called mammon. All of that, guys, we learned in Hilchos Niskei Mammon earlier on in the early chapters. That was on Pedig base. Another rule. Whenever an injury is going to be evaluated on how much was that person worth in the slave market without it, how much is he worth now? Like, how do you evaluate someone who got injured? What's the loss? So that Rambam already established that's not real compensation. No one would agree to get that money and to have themselves injured that way. Just we don't have another way of putting a price on a person or on a person's organ, but that's all in the category of knas that Rambam says. Don't think that you're compensated. The guy was worth 20 grand, and now without a hand, he's only worth 15 grand. So what his loss of a hand is worth $5,000. A person will give all of the money in the world not to lose a hand. So the Rambam says all of that is a knas. And therefore, it cannot be collected by the Yonei Chutz La'aretz. And let's go back to the 5 categories. Now I'll make a good review. If one person injures his fellow, that's common occurrence. Ein goivin, nezek, damages, the pain and the shame cannot be collected. Because even though there is a big price to it, it's not real financial compensation. But sheves, which is the guy is unemployed, that is a real financial loss that you can measure. The guy would have worked, he would have gotten the way we said before. Ripui, medical bills. These are the 2 parts of the damages that are called financial matters. That has to be collected in Chutz La'aretz because there's financial loss, and again, it's called common occurrence. That even over there in wherever the Goinim were in Babel, the Goinim moved to Europe at the end of the era of the Goinim. That ligboy Shabbos v'ripoi b'Babel halacha yudal. The heimash yizika so adam if animal damaged the person, like we said before, then we don't collect any of the damages through dayanim of outside of Israel. Dayanim without smicha cannot collect damages because it's considered something that's not a common occurrence. Aval adam, but a person that's mazik his fellow's animal, that's common occurrence. The shalom nezik shalom b'chol makom. Just like if I tear your garment, if I break your utensils, if I cut your trees, that is something that I have to pay, and I can be taken to court even by judges that don't have smicha. The same thing as if I injure your animal. An animal that damaged by eating, that's common occurrence, or by walking. Not a domesticated animal that behaved wildly. No, it's just eating, and while it ate for something of mine that has a lot of value. Anything for which the owner has to pay full damage right away, and it's something that's a common occurrence, that should be taken to court even by judges outside of Israel. So even if one animal damaged another animal in all common cases, for example, one animal rubbed itself on someone else. That's a common thing. That's not the animal became wild. Their back was itching. Or ochlan, I have the word oifes. I don't think it's oifes. Probably it's petas. Or if it ate produce. It ate produce that it always eats. It happened to be my produce, so the guy has to pay me, but it's a common occurrence. Or if it damaged foods or utensils in a way that we learned this in Hilchos Niskei Mamein, that the owner has to right away pay full compensation. All of that should be and has to be judged, adjudicated, even by judges that are outside of Israel. But any animal that does damages for the first few times, that halachically we define that act as an act of tamus, which means that the owner doesn't even have to pay for full damage. He only has to pay for half a damage, even if afterwards the animal did it 3 times. And the owner was forewarned. And now this animal becomes a warned animal, and now the owner has to pay full damage. Like if it bit, if it gored, if it squatted, etc. In all of these cases, even after the animal becomes a muad, because the concept of muad can never happen in chutz la'aretz. Amazing. Furthermore, even if the animal was warned, that means the owner of the animal was told, in the Holy Land, your animal is behaving like a wild animal. Guard your animal better. But the animal went outside the Holy Land and did the damage as a muad. Chutz la'aretz, ein goy v'niskoy. Why? Because that's already not a common occurrence. Amazing. Halacha Yud Beis. Now, why don't we establish a muad? Because how does an animal become a muad? By people testifying it in front of a real beis din that your animal did that damage. There ain't some beis din. There is no beis din. And the Rambam therefore comes to a conclusion. If people who got smicha, the real smicha in Israel, if they located themselves or relocated themselves out of Israel, now, Kishem, just like such a beis din is empowered to judge even din knossos for chutz la'aretz, other people's animals can be rendered from a tam into a muad in front of them, and over there the owners will have to pay nezek shalom. Halacha 13. If a person steals or if he robbed, now we said by robbing in itself is not machayev kefil, but if the person robbed and denied it in an oath, with an oath, and then they do tshuva, they will have to add the 5th. But the addition, which is the double or the 5th, you can't collect. Halacha 14. In other words, as a rule, guys, when I admit to something that I or my property did, the general rule is that if the type of penalty payment is in the category of monetary payment, my admission will obligate me to pay. Normally, the rule is that if I admit to something that I did, but the penalty of the Torah is in the category of a knas, it's called a penalty, then my admission will never obligate me to pay the knas. That's the general rule. It's called moide b'knas pater. However, guys, let's remember that there are some exceptions to that. There are certain items that even though I was the one that admitted to whatever wrongdoing happened, I will have to pay the knas. The Rambam says, yet that can never be collected by judges without smicha or judges of chutz la'aretz. Don't say that since if you would be moida, you would be chayiv. That makes that not knas. It remains a knas. For example, pegam, the blemish, boishes, bahakoifer, as we learned above. These are items that even though you were the ones that admitted to the crime, you have to pay. Like if a man says, I seduced the daughter of so-and-so, or if a person admits, my ox killed a person. The halacha there is that all of the penalties will be conferred on the person. So you would say, oy bazoi, it's not called knas. It is called knas. And therefore, it's halacha 15. Guys, if it's a good opportunity to review. So we learned 2 rules, the way we worded it in the sheet of the Rambam. And when we learned it then, we said that's a lot of controversy, exactly what is the opinion of the Rambam. But let's go with the approach that we took when we learned it. If I cause damage to happen, if it's called an indirect cause, that's called grama. The Rambam ruled that even though I'm chayiv b'din hashamayim, I'm pater medina yav. That means that a beis din cannot oblige me to pay. But the Rambam says, garmi, that's the way we interpreted it, direct causes is something that a person is obligated to pay. So therefore, the Rambam says, dine gramois don't have are not on the category of a penalty, and therefore, goyven oisan, v'doinen oisan, even b'chutz la'aretz. Yavaldik halacha tezayin. A person gives money of a Jew over to a guy, like Meiser, the Masud, even though he only did it verbally, he didn't do any action. Nevertheless, this is also an area of finances that should be and must be adjudicated, even though the judges don't have smicha, even though it's dayane chutz la'aretz. Halacha 17. Minig yeshivas b'chutz la'aretz. The meaning of all of the yeshivas is that afal pi she'ein goyim sham knas, even though, as we mentioned, there are many limitations to what the judges may not get involved in, it doesn't mean that they're going to let the guy, the perpetrator, off scot-free. They found a way how to get him. They put him into a band, they put him into a chayim. Until he appeases the person to whom he wronged. Now, how normally will that person get appeased? Doesn't mean that I'll have to give him all of the money that normally he would have to give, but they only had it Yisrael. But normally appeasement, I mean, it could be the guy will be appeased simply by the guy admitting and asking and apologizing. But sometimes it's going to also involve some sort of financial agreement. Or they can only remove the nidoi if they're living at a time that in Israel there's real smicha. Let them both go to Israel and let them stand in front of a court that has the power to adjudicate these cases. The moment he'll settle it, then they're going to take away the ban. In other words, if the judges of Israel told him, or even if Chutz La'aretz, if there would have been smicha, then he would have to pay 10,000 golden coins, and he gave it. The other party is refusing to be appeased. Then the Beis Din is going to take off the ban. Another din, interestingly, that if the damaged party, knowing that the Beis Din nowadays, the Beis Din out of Israel cannot adjudicate these cases, but I know the halach. And if there would have been smicha, or if we would have been in Israel with a Beis Din of smicha, then the ruling would have been that so-and-so who wronged me will have to pay me $100. What happens if he grabs $100? He shouldn't do that. But if he did it, Beis Din is going to remove the ban. They won't take it out of him. The final halach of this chapter, halacha 18, if you have a yachid, if you have an individual that's called a mumchal rabim, that means he has experience in these areas. And as we learned yesterday, FLP, that he's allowed to adjudicate financial cases all by himself, even though it doesn't have a din of a Beis Din, but there is such a power that he's given. Nevertheless, if one party admitted to any types of financial obligations in his presence, it doesn't have any power. It means nothing. And furthermore, even if this yachid has smicha, this is a very important rule. If I admit, Baruch, right now in the shul, I owe Chaim money, I'm not obligated to pay Chaim money. If I admitted that in front of a court, I'm bound by my admission. If I admit to something not in front of a court, I have the right to claim later that, people thought that I'm very wealthy, I'm getting an ayin hara. I want people to think that I have a lot of debts, for people not to look at me that way, or other types of such justifications. The person will not be bound by his admission. So the Rambam is saying that when you have the yachid mumcha, even with smicha, admission doesn't mean anything. But on the other hand, in contrast, if you have three people, even none of them have smicha, so they're called hedyoitas, and they're not called Elohim. If one party admits in front of that today's Beis Din, I owe money, he'll be bound by his admission, and likewise in a denial. So one of the rules that we learned in Toin Venitin is that once a person states his case in court, you cannot change your narrative. And we learned exceptions that if I tweak it and I add something, at least I'm explaining to the Beis Din, I'm not changing it, I'm just explaining what I meant. Sometimes I'll have that power. But as a rule, I cannot change my claim. So what happens if I deny that I owe money? And then witnesses come and they say that I do owe money. So then I say, no. I claim that I never loaned, I never borrowed money. What I meant was I paid back. That's called I'm changing my claim. So if a person made a denial in front of a Beis Din, even though they don't have smicha and they're called idiotis and they're not called Elohim, and witnesses come and the witnesses refute my denial, I deny that I ever borrowed the money, and now I want to make a new claim. No, I borrowed the money, I only paid back. I cannot do that. In other words, there is a lot of power to a Beis Din even of nowadays. And in certain areas, like the Rambam is writing in this final halacha, Beis Din of 3 now has more status of a Beis Din than the Yachid who has smicha, who has the right to give rulings. Just like a Beis Din of Smuchim v'chol hadvarim. Gewaldig. Hilchos Sanhedrin v'ha'onchin ha'masunu lahem, Perek Shishi, is a huge chapter. Now, really, this can take people a very long time to learn, like everything else. Every word is golden. The way that Rambam formalizes it and organizes it is golden. It's quantitatively a very small chapter, relative, but we're going to be dealing with what happens if judges err in a halachic ruling. When will they be responsible? When will they not be responsible? When do we overturn their judgment and when do we not? This chapter has 9 halachas, beginning with halacha al. Kol dayan shadon dirimaminus. Any judge who adjudicated a financial case and the judge made a mistake. So guys, this is the first thing we have to clarify. If his mistake was within a very clear and open area of halacha, like what makes something clear? All of the laws that are explicitly addressed in the Mishnah or the Talmud, which means that this was simply, it's not that there were 2 opinions and he sided with the minority opinion. No, it's clear. He made a mistake. The rule is choizer hadin.
Yeah, I'm in class.
Let me just get this on mute for a second. Choizer hadin means that, whoa. How do I do this? I forgot. Participants. Good. Choizer hadin means that the ruling will be overturned. We don't say, oh, it's going to take away the honor or the reverence people have to the court. No, that you can't rule against the din mefurish. And you bring things back to the way they were before, and now you re-adjudicate the case. Now, you can't always bring it back as it was before. The Rambam gives practical examples. For example, there was a din toida between Reuven and Shimon. By the clear din of the Mishnah, in other words, there's no debate that halachically, Reuven does not owe the money. Beis Din made a mistake, and they said, Reuven, you have to give Shimon. What happens if prior to people realizing that Beis Din made such an error, Reuven gave money to Shimon, and Shimon went overseas? You can't get the money back. They're going to but he went to Lemedina Sayam. Or if Shimon is Pasha the mafioso, once he got the money, he's never going to give it back. Or in other areas of Jewish law, for example, something that was pure was rendered impure. They paskined it's impure. And once they ruled it's impure, this act, so the guy says, if it's impure anyways, I can take it into a home where there's a corpse. Now it's impure regardless. In other words, based on the ruling, you did not guard it, and now it's tummy. Or they said on something that was kosher, they gave a wrong, they said it's treif. If it's treif, the guy fed it to his dogs. It's eaten up already. It was ruined because it had a lot more value. You can't undo the damage. Question now is, are the judges liable? So the rule is, patur milashalem. The judges don't have to compensate. Now we're speaking about judges that have smicha. Now we mentioned this quickly in the previous chapter. Here is where you have a huge difference. Since they have smicha, that means they were given permission to judge, to rule, they don't have to pay. Even though they caused damage, but they didn't have intent to damage. Okay. Very good. Now, what happens in contrast, halacha beis, tov b'shikaladas. Something that requires a discussion and the weighing of das to decide whether we're going to follow this opinion or that opinion. In other words, it's an area in halacha where there's room to say both sides. For example, it's something that there is already an argument between Tanoim or between Amoraim, and there was never a clear-cut halachic ruling befedish like one of them. Also, and this based in this dayan chose one side. What they did not know is that it became common acceptance to follow the other side. So now it depends. If this guy was an expert, it means he had smicha. And or like we learned in chapter 4, this other way of getting permit to judge by the head of the galus doesn't give you smicha, but it gives you the right to adjudicate. Or even if he didn't have not this or not that, but the people accepted that person to be their judge, and he has experience, he's qualified, since he's a mumcha. So we say like this: the ruling goes back because he still made a mistake. But if he cannot bring things back, like we learned, the guy who got the money, now that we know not correctly, so went away, the judge doesn't have to pay. Another nuance, but a guy who only got smicha from the great Sanhedrin or from someone who had smicha, that's only if he gave that ruling in the Holy Land, but not if he gave the halach, not if he gave any ruling b'chutz laretz, as we learned in the 4th chapter in Perek Halacha Yudal. If the one who made a mistake was not a judge, but it was a whole beis din, but the shus, they did not have permission. Or even if the people accepted him, but he is not expert experienced, and he made such a mistake, now he might be more reliable. But also it depends. Sometimes the judge himself with his hands takes the money from one party and gives it to the other party. That means that they directly wrong. And the guy will have to pay. And if he did not do it directly, so we try to get it back. And if not, you have to compensate. Wow. If someone is not expert and the baladinim did not accept it, and even though he has an ishus from the Rosh Golus, and as we learned at the end of chapter 4, that if someone who's not qualified is given permission, it's worthless. We view this guy as a man of force. He's not even ruled as a judge. None of his rulings are rulings, whether he made a mistake, whether he didn't make a mistake. And all of the litigants, if they want, they can say whatever he did is out. Let's bring things back the way they were, and they go in front of a proper basis. Wow. Furthermore, and if this judge or this court made a mistake and they did so directly, the judges have to pay out of their own pockets. And let the judges now run after the party who received the money wrongfully to try to make things right, to get their money back. If they could. Now, it's tough luck on the judges, Yishalim. Like any other person that directly causes damage, because anyone who's not fit to be a judge, who acts like a judge, is someone who's intending to do damage. Let's go back to what we learned yesterday. I think it was the end of the 1st chapter, that people were very careful not to be judges. And that goes to all of us. Halacha hey, dayan shotov. If a judge makes a mistake, and their mistake was not that they gave a ruling regarding finances, not that they gave a ruling regarding whether something is kosher or not, but they obligated one party to take an oath. The guy that was told by a beis din, or by the judge to take an oath, didn't want to take an oath. So that forced him to make some sort of compromise. He says, you know what? Instead of taking an oath, I'll pay you off. But he made an agreement, even if it's only a compromise, to pay anything, to abnegate himself, to get out of the dayan's judgment, make an oath. Now, what happens if the judge made a mistake? And really, al pi halacha, he's not chayiv to take an oath. He can undo the whole compromise. He can say, I made the compromise, even with the kinyan, based on a wrong ruling. For us, it was Pshat and Baldina, and then we discovered that the dayan or the beis din made a mistake. In other words, this is a topic for which halachically you're not chayiv to take an oath, even though you made a kinyan regarding the pshata, you shook hands, you made a real kinyan, ain't a klum. Because so it was all based on a mistake. The kinyan betos is retracted. Gewaldig. When you have two people that are fighting in a court, fighting regarding a matter. And one of these two litigants says, let's find a beis din locally. The other litigant says, no, let's go to the beis din Haggadah. Let's go to a greater court. Let's go back to the times of the Beis Hamikdash, let's go, or post Beis Hamikdash when there was a Sanhedrin, let's go to the greatest court. Why? Because Shema Yitu Elo Hadayanim, because maybe the judges here who are not as great as, they're gonna pass in a wrong halachic psak. That's a great question. In other words, what happens now? These are very important rules. So the Rambam begins like this. There's going to be many Bamed Dvarim Amurim. Just saying this right now. There's going to be many qualifications to what we're learning. But the first thing that Rambam writes is that the one who wants for this matter to be adjudicated locally will win. Now, Im Omar, what the other party who did not want to rely on the local Beis Din, if he's going to say Kisvu Tnuli Me'ei Zeh Tam Dantuni, he's telling the local Beis Din that he never trusted that much. Okay, I'm coming to you, but you can't just write Chayiv Pater, kosher treif. You have to write your ruling, and you have to give on paper why did you come, how did you come to that ruling. And he's saying it clearly. Why am I demanding that of you? Because I don't trust you guys. Maybe you guys will be making a mistake. The local Beis Din is chayiv to write to this litigant, how did they come to the ruling? After he has it in hand, they will demand of him, if he was found guilty, let's say in a financial manner, to pay. And this is really what Dr. Baruch was mentioning before. In other words, this gives the party the power to go in front of another Beis Din and to apply everything we learned in the 6th chapter until now, which is really very nuanced. Because if there's going to be a consensus that they made a mistake, then we'll follow the rules we learned in this chapter until Halacha 6. Another thing, a local Beis Din, they have the right not to be certain. They can consult. If the local Dayanim feel, let's get the input of a greater Dayanim. They do so. How do they do so? By writing down the issues, by sending it to the great Beis Din, by asking of them. The great Beis Din will give an opinion. They're going to send it back to the local Dayanim. If it resonates with them, then they're going to give the ruling. In other words, it's not like if the local Dayanim feel that I have to consult, it disqualifies them. It doesn't work that way. They consult, they get a response, and they give the ruling locally. Of course, they should follow. If they are admitting that they need guidance, they should follow the guidance. But it's going to work that way. Now let's go. Let's start tweaking everything. That what? That one litigant compels the other one to adjudicate locally, even though the other one is saying, I want to go to a greater court. That's bishar dinim, regarding judgments. That what? Where both litigants have claims. Like when you have two partners, right? In other words, the key is none of them is halachically the muhzak. None of them are the muhzak. That gives the right for whichever one says, adjudicate locally for his opinion to be heard. But, or let's go to a common case that even Dayani Chutz La'aretz can give rulings in, which is case of loans, that if the lender says, the lender has the power, because he gave the money, he loaned the money. If he says, I want this to be adjudicated locally, I don't want to have to, I loaned your money and now to get it back, I have to go schlep to another city. I don't want to do that. Even though the loiva is saying, let's go to the Beis Din Hagadol, we're going to listen to the malva. But what happens in the flip? But if the malva, the lender says, let's go to the Beis Din Hagadol, then the borrower has to go over there. And that's the meaning of the verse said by King Solomon, that the borrower becomes an eved, becomes subservient to the malva. That's what he meant. And I know another thing that Rambam didn't speak out explicitly, he wants us to understand. If the person who's the muhzak, I'm a muhzak, and you're making a claim against me, I have the right to say, I'm not going to go over here. I'm only going to go in front of greater judges. Okay, another thing. If one is claiming against the other, you injured me, you damaged me. In other words, like I said, muhzak. In other words, the defendant, I'm sorry, in a case of injury or damage, then the local Beis Din will tell me you have to go up. That you force him to go up, Means I have to bring to the local basin enough proof that that guy injured me. I cannot make you Meshuggah, stam claim you injured me and now you have to go with me to Yerushalayim. Because if I bring Edom to the local basin, or there are other proofs that someone was robbed, someone was damaged, there has to be proof that the guy is actually a lender. Then the lender forces the borrower to go to Yerushalayim. The guy who's claiming victim of injury or of damage can force the other to go to Yerushalayim. But for stam an empty claim without any proof locally, you can't be mechayiv the other person to move at all. The only thing you could do in a local beis din is, as we keep on learning, is rabbinically, when you are claiming I owe you and I'm making a full denial, I have to take a rabbinic oath, shua assessors. That has to be made. But you're not going to move me to travel with you. And the final halach of this chapter, halacha tes, v'chein hadin b'zman hazeh. And so is the rule nowadays. What's nowadays? Even though nowadays there is no beis din hagadol, there is no beis din hagadol, but you know what you have nowadays? You have certain batei dinim in every generation that they are known to be the experts of this topic. Like we're living right now in Los Angeles, I can say that the beis din, there's a beis din in Muncie that are renowned that in matters of money, of choshen mishpat, they're the biggest experts. So this same concept, can one party force the other? I don't want this to be adjudicated locally, even though the Dayanim here are amazing in Los Angeles, but financial matters, they are known to be the greatest experts, have the most experience. And there are certain places that have teachers and students that there's no other place like it. Let's go back to this case. If the lender says, I want to go to that location, which is in our country, has to be in the same country. That's my example. You're living in LA, I want to go to the East Coast. And I want to go in front of that great judge. And I want this to be adjudicated over there. He has that right. And the Rambam concludes, not only is that theoretically, but the kach, hoyu, maisim, besfard, b'chol yoim, that in Spain, there were certain cities where Toida centers, they were renowned as being a Toida center. In these exceptional cases, when there's a malva, or you have proof through Edim that you were injured or you were damaged, that you have the right, if you want, to adjudicate the case where you choose, even if it means you have to travel from city to city. God willing, to be continued.
Rabbi, the idea about a consensus of rabbis that had so much power, like, for example, the last time the rabbis said electricity was not was the same thing as whatever they said, there was a consensus. We followed it for 100 years. Is that sort of the same power that they have when it comes to smicha for a new person down the road? You mentioned
no, it's not as powerful as. I'll tell you why. Doctor. Because if there's a consensus right now, you said electricity. What were to happen if we were to scientifically better understand electricity?
Well, you'd still keep what the rabbis say.
The rabbis would have to change their minds.
I see.
And once smicha is given, it's unretractable. That's the difference. All halachic rulings are theoretically retractable, not because the halacha will change, but because the halacha is ruling something of the world. I think our understanding of the world is constantly evolving, and that has a lot of halachic consequence, because it's like you're a doctor. The rules of medicine, even if they don't change, but if you come to a different diagnosis, because you have there's some new knowledge in the world, then you're going to give another